This Memorial Day weekend, please take a moment to remember the ultimate sacrifice. George Floyd. Yes, it's been 3 years now since he who was without sin, other than robbing a woman at gunpoint and tranquilizing himself into martyrdom, and of course, stealing via counterfeit cash before he did. 3 long years since our Lord and Savior left us. But of course, you won't forget that anyway, because our president has ensured he is properly remembered in our hearts and minds this weekend. Go ahead and forget D-Day, forget Iwo Jima, forget the 13 Marines and soldiers Joe Biden got killed just 2 years ago in Afghanistan. We will never forget what happened May 25th, 2020 to George Floyd. We will never forget George Floyd's name. We will never stop taking action in his honor, the president tweeted. Well, we probably should stop taking action in his honor, actually. Not just because George Floyd didn't show much honor for others during his own lifetime, but because that action in his honor has been nothing but destructive on top of it. The rap sheet in George Floyd's honor is, of course, far worse than even George Floyd's rap sheet itself. Billions in property damage, dozens dead, and the destruction of local police forces that would otherwise stop and bring justice to these crimes. But there are at least a few of us who have benefited greatly from St. Floyd's sacrifice, and by that I mean a very small selection of racial hucksters who have converted George's death into millions in personal enrichment. That, of course, being the people behind Black Lives Matter, the official national organization. Original co-founder Patrisse Cullors coined the hashtag in 2013, and formed the organization formally in 2015, putting her Marxist training to use.
We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on sort of ideological theories.
Awfully ironic, of course, that the Marxist training translated into ruthless, corrupt, personally enriching capitalism as George Floyd's death attracted some $80 million in donations to the organization, much of which Patrisse Cullors used to buy fancy personal properties and other unrelated luxuries. Cullors claimed these homes were for community spaces, but never used the spaces communally. All that happened there was a birthday party for her son, and a Biden inauguration party, and a brief stint with an attempted cooking show in which we were supposed to believe that this woman had never tried baked goods before, or at least never tried baking her own before.
We're in a glorious kitchen because we are starting something new called Patrisse Tries. I'm going to be trying stuff I've never done before.
Was it good? Mm-hmm. Patrisse did good.
Bomb. Bomb, bomb, bomb.
Chef.
Tracy the Chef. That's my new name.
Yeah, Tracy the Thief would be the better title, actually, and way too much peach cobbler is the problem here, not too little. Regardless, using the mansion kitchen for personal baking time instead of purposes related to the cause created the suspicion that pushed Patrisse Cullors out. So she resigned from Black Lives Matter in spring 2021, ostensibly to pursue new career opportunities, but of course, in reality, the scrutiny of the group's corrupt finances, much like her fancy kitchen, had simply become too hot. It was a national scam of massive proportions, dwarfed only by simultaneous corona relief that said, "Hold my vaccine," and scammed the public out of billions more in so-called relief. But in the year after George Floyd's death, Black Lives Matter raked in tens of millions of dollars in charitable donations premised on the idea of fighting institutional racism, while the group's management simply personally pocketed a huge portion of that money. And now there's an update to the story, thanks to the Washington Free Beacon getting a copy of Black Lives Matter's latest filing with the IRS. We can see a few financial trends emerging for the organization, or just some continuing. Most significantly, the cash has dramatically dried up, but the corruption has not. Black Lives Matter is quickly running out of money, but what they do have is still being paid handsomely to personal family and friends for completely dubious reasons. And remember, the reason we can see these numbers at all is because Black Lives Matter is a 501c3 charity. The organization does not pay any federal taxes, and people who donate to them can deduct those donations from their taxable income. So in exchange for a free pass from the IRS, the organization agrees to transparency. And despite being so transparently corrupt and spending almost nothing on their supposed mission of racial justice, they still enrich themselves and their friends tax-free. This financial disclosure covers the year ending June 30th, 2022, and the first thing it shows is that the George Floyd gravy train is quickly drying up. In the prior year, the year immediately after George Floyd's death, Black Lives Matter pulled $77 million in donations, but the year after, the most recent fiscal year ending last summer, donations were down almost 90%. Only $9.3 million for the year. And that could be due to a number of factors. Maybe George Floyd enthusiasm just ran out. Maybe this public news of corruption caused some donors to hesitate. Or here's another factor for consideration. The government funny money hose turned off too. Because by the end of this fiscal year, the supposedly free checks from the government were phasing out, and the corresponding inflation was phasing in, and so people had to get smarter with their expenses, and mansions for Patrisse Cullors and company just didn't make the cut anymore. Of course, it's impossible to say exactly how much government funny money was funneled straight to Black Lives Matter, but I will speculate confidently that it is a factor to explain why the organization had so much income in 2021 and comparatively so little in 2022. So just remember, the next time you get another inflated bill that's tough to cover, at least Black Lives Matter fraudsters are able to cover theirs. But whatever the cause, income is drying up, but spending is not, at least on the same scale. Black Lives Matter continues to spend in the millions on, yes, mysterious, not fully described, quite likely nonsense, unrelated to the group's charitable mission. Black Lives Matter spent $17 million in 2022. Now, that's down about half from the year prior, but that's still $8.5 million more than they took in for the year. So they operated at a multi-million-dollar loss, and what exactly their costs are remains unclear. In fact, the number one expense they had, half of all their spending, is $8.5 million for other, specifically, or not specifically, other in fees or services from non-employees. What they paid people for work, in other words. What people and what work is not fully disclosed, but the largest pieces are, and what they show is that even operating at a loss, Black Lives Matter has not quit the corruption, and probably won't until the last dollar is gone. Because while Patrisse Cullors may be gone, the cash flow to her friends and family is not. In fact, Patrisse's brother Paul remains one of only 2 paid employees of Black Lives Matter, and he made $1.6 million from the organization in 2022, providing professional security services. See, it's not enough corruption just to buy mansions for your own personal enjoyment. You gotta corruptly pay your brother to protect them too, as demonstrated not just by the nepotism, but as demonstrated by the fact that despite getting paid for professional security services, Paul Cullors has no prior professional security experience. His career prior was graffiti art, and I will guess that he was not earning 7 figures for this artwork, so it's a very nice raise for him. Prior to her departure, Patrisse Cullors said they had to hire Paul for security, even if he is completely unqualified, because other security firms commonly hire former police officers, and of course, former cops can't be trusted not to kneel on Patrisse's neck. And it's not just her brother. When Patrisse Cullors left, it's not like they brought in some charity watchdog to clean house. They just brought in her similarly corrupt friends to do the same thing under different names. Cicely Gay was brought in to chair the organization, plus Patrisse's other friends, DeJane Parker and Shalamaya Bowers, joined the board, all of whom have worked closely with Cullors for years prior, and the same corrupt insiders continued to get paid for nonsense. Last fall, Bowers was accused of stealing $10 million from the organization to pay for his own personal expenses. And I'm not sure how that lawsuit was resolved, but we don't have to listen to mere accusations. We can look at Black Lives Matter's own disclosures. Oh wow, Bowers got paid $1.7 million last year for consulting. How convenient that the wisest consultant available just so happens to sit on the board and just so happens to be best friends with Patrice. And not just one, but two, because that wasn't enough insider consulting, actually. The organization spent $1 million more on consulting from Danielle Edwards, the sister of Raymond Howard, who also sits on the board. So for an organization that's taken in about $86 million in the last 2 years, we know that they spent $12 million of it on fancy homes. In just the last year, we know that they spent over $10 million on contractors, many of whom are directly linked to Patrisse Cullors' friends and family. So that's at least a quarter of the money spent on highly suspect expenses with highly suspect personal connections that have produced exactly zero social or racial justice to date. And that's just what they admit to. That says nothing about the millions in theft allegations otherwise, the efforts to conceal the mansion purchases as charitable grants for social justice, and other methods of concealment about which the group is far less transparent. This is tax fraud. This is an organization completely neglecting its charitable mission that erases its tax liability. This is charity fraud. No Black lives are in fact mattering more as the donations are premised upon, except for maybe 3 or 4 Black lives mattering very, very much, living in mansions that also matter very, very much too. But the charitable mission of pursuing justice for racially abused Black people is not being served. Donors are being deceived. And this is political fraud. The organization is pushing some big social problem, supposed deadly racist policing, knowing that it's a made-up or dishonestly presented issue, as evidenced by the fact that the charity's own management doesn't actually care about it enough to put any significant money toward it. And as evidenced by the fact that this fraud is so transparent, yet no supposedly racist law enforcement agencies are at all interested in prosecuting it. All of these people belong in prison, and there is an easy case to do that. But our justice system is so biased in their favor, actually, that even an IRS with expanded resources will pass on the alley-oop slam dunk tax fraud case that this is. The IRS says they want to go after rich tax dodgers. Well, here are the rich tax dodgers they are guaranteed not to. So if you're one of the people who buys into the propaganda, who buys into the president's tweet, who buys into the idea that our country must atone for the racial injustice committed against George Floyd, well, I still think you're overlooking the injustice George Floyd committed against George Floyd, but on what basis is prosecuting this case not a natural extension of that view? If abuse of George Floyd is such a great injustice, then where is the justice in this abuse of camping on his grave to personally cash in for millions, getting literally fat and happy off his suffering? Because if you're offended by what Derek Chauvin did, well, he's rotting in prison for the next 2 decades plus for it. So that quest for justice is now over. But these people kneel on St. Floyd every day that they collect a fraudulent dollar in his name. And somehow that's not only not offensive, that's celebrated, actually, because we're such a racist country or something. Yes, a country so racist where simply being Black and crying victim isn't just a viable career path. It's actually the successful strategy of a multi-millionaire. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Gab. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chatting my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.